Welcome to another edition of the Hitting the Hardwood podcast, your home for all the latest Minnesota Lynx and WNBA news, analysis, and coverage. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. I'm your host, Mitchell Hansen, and I'm thrilled to be joined this week by someone many of you are familiar with who follow the college basketball game and the WNBA, Lyndsey D'Arcangelo, who covers the WNBA and college basketball for The Athletic, Just Women's Sports, basically everywhere else, and she is a co-author of Hail Mary, The Rise and the Fall of the NWFL. Welcome, Lyndsey. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into things, let's start by just kind of giving people an idea where they can find all of your work. I said, like I mentioned, you're kind of everywhere, but tell people where they can follow your work, where they can follow you on social media and kind of everywhere else.
Yeah, I've been at The Athletic for, it's going to be 5 years now, this July, which is kind of wild. But yeah, like you mentioned, I write about the WNBA and women's college basketball for The Athletic. And then I also do some stuff for Just Women's Sports on the side as well. And yeah, and basically I tweet a lot about women's basketball all the time, actually.
To follow your coverage and the coverage that you give, not only the WNBA, but women's basketball in general. So it's a lot of great stuff, and thank you for your hard work and all that you do.
Oh, I appreciate that. You know, it's nice to have that validation when you hear that sometimes. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's get right into some of the questions, if you don't mind. I first kind of wanted just to talk to you a little bit about the off season. It's kind of been a busy off season. We've seen kind of, I would say, maybe a little bit of a realignment with just kind of the, how top heavy the WNBA is and the, the free agents that have shifted teams this off season. What are your thoughts on the busy off season and kind of things that have unfolded so far?
Yeah, so we sort of, people say that we enter this super team era because, you have Brianna Stewart, Jonquel Jones, Courtney Vandersloot, all in New York City now with the Liberty, and then Candace Parker joining the Aces. Was essentially, they're just both very talented teams on paper. We've already seen what Vegas could do without Parker, and to have her on that team now is kind of wild. But yeah, so we've seen these teams sort of develop in the past, but always through the draft. Like Minnesota, as you know, was a dynasty for a little bit with Maya Moore and Rebecca Brunson and Lindsay Whalen and Sylvia Fowles, and we've seen this before, but to have it being done through free agency, I think, is what has caught everybody's eye. And Simone Augustus, obviously, how could I forget her as well on the Lynx? So so I think that's why that caused a lot of conversation about this new era of superstar players taking less money to sort of go play with each other. And it's, like I said, it's not like we haven't seen it before. It's just happening in a different way now. And then you have other teams that are really focusing and trying to rebuild and get better through the draft. Dallas Wings, casted a wide net and drafted a haul of riches, hoping to find that right combination to put around Enrique Ngubale. And then Indiana, with the first overall pick, Leah Boston, trying to just capitalize on their draft class from last season. So yeah, and then you have these other teams that sort of just held back and maybe didn't need to do anything, and because of what they already have, like the Washington Mystics. So there was some movement, and I think it was a fun kind of frenetic free agency, like it's been in the past few years now, since the new CBA allowed for more player autonomy in that way. And it'll be interesting to see how it all comes together.
Yeah, I obviously Las Vegas and New York are going to get a lot of the attention, just strictly based on how good they are and how stacked they are, and rightfully so. And it's also the most recent thing we've seen. So they're obviously going to be on the forefront of everything. But in past episode or past podcasts, I've even talked to a few guests that, we have always talk about Washington. Washington's kind of I don't want to say they're sneaky because they're always there, but they're kind of like a little bit of an under the radar team this year. And I think a team that could put up a good fight with some of those top two teams and be right there at the end of the year. Do you kind of agree with that as well?
I completely agree. In fact, they're my dark horse team for this season. They're totally being forgotten about. And when you have a healthy Elena Deladon who says she's fully healthy and is going to play the whole season, that changes the whole dynamic because they have a really good starting five and a good bench. They didn't need to do much in free agency. They didn't even need to add much in the draft, and they have a solid team. And I think they're sort of being forgotten about in this conversation.
I do think that the coaching situation, obviously with Mike Tebow kind of stepping aside and Eric stepping in, I do think that, and now this is going to sound like a knock on Eric, but I don't mean it to come across that way. But I do think that a younger head coach could matter or could make a difference in the postseason. You oftentimes see, that, people don't like to view coaching as making that big of a, or making that much of an impact. But I think it could, especially when you have best of 7 series. Let's say it's game 7, could just be a, a last minute decision, coaching decision that makes all the difference. So I'm not saying that will happen, but I'm curious to see what will happen with Eric's transition or Eric's move into kind of taking things over. And I do think that that's where maybe the other two teams, or those top two teams that we did mention, they kind of maybe have a little bit of the upper hand right now, along with the other talent that they have.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point to make and one to keep an eye on. But I also think Mike's still going to have a hand. He's still going to have Eric's ear. And in-game decisions aside, I think there's still going to be some tutelage going on there and some guidance when need be.
What this kind of leads into my next question, and we kind of already talked about it a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the overall layout and kind of the structure of the league? Do you think it's going to be kind of maybe in like years past where, we have those 3-4 teams atop the league, and then basically everybody after that's just kind of, a game apart from each other and kind of pretty even? Or what do you think will be kind of the layout of the league this year?
I mean, we could see that play out. Last year, it was the Aces and the Chicago Sky and Connecticut Sun that were sort of the top echelon, and then Seattle and Washington, and then there was a drop off, right? We could see that this year. This is the thing, is with this season, like you have these good teams on paper, but how's it going to go? How's it going to work out on the court? Because there's always an adjustment period. There's always a chemistry issue that plays itself out in some way, shape, or form. How long that'll last remains to be seen, or they could just come out and click right away. So we kind of got to wait and see. And then you have these younger teams, like, will Dallas finally figure out a roster that makes sense and a rotation that makes sense? Because that's been their issue for the past 3 or 4 seasons since Enrique got there. And then Indiana, what kind of step are they going to take this season? How's their growth going to go? And then even with Minnesota, what are they going to look like without Sylvia and Nafisa Collier kind of taking the reins as the leader in the face of that team? Atlanta, Ryan Howard, how is she going to capitalize on last year's success? I mean, they were great defensively and they needed some offensive help, which I think they've gotten. So, there's a lot that's up in the air, and it's exciting though.
I do think that, and I agree with you that it will be maybe more so than in past years interesting to see how those first weeks and months kind of unfold, or weeks and maybe just the first month. Because I do, even with the top teams, I think, like that's where I think Las Vegas has the upper hand. Now, granted, they did add a few pieces. Candace Parker, as you mentioned, is obviously a key one. That will take some time, I think, to mesh, but that's where I think they have the upper hand over, a New York right away, is that New York has basically a brand new team and a brand new, starting five, and it's going to take some time. They're familiar with each other, but it still takes time to mesh and become that championship caliber team. So I do agree that even, from the top down, it's going to take some time for either rookies, or young prospects to establish, or, the veterans to kind of mesh together, which makes things very interesting. One thing that, outside of, kind of what we just talked about of not really knowing what to expect and kind of keeping an eye on that, how teams, mesh together at the start of the year. What's one thing that you're going to be watching at the start of the year? Yeah, I guess if you could put your finger on one thing, what's one thing that you're most interested in, whether it's preseason or even at the start of the season?
I mean, I actually have a handful of things. That first and foremost is Brittany Griner's return to the court. I really do think with what she's been through, and so thankful that she's back, and she seems to be adjusting really well, from our vantage point as far as what she presented in her press conference. And she seems eager to get back on the court, and just it almost seems like her love of basketball having it been taken away from her, and almost, she didn't know if she'd ever play again. And so to have that renewed love for the game, I think we're going to see a different Brittany Griner this season, a more motivated, a more joyful Brittany Griner than we have in the past. It's just the vibe that I get. But how great is it going to be to see her play in that first game for everybody? So that's number one. And I'm excited to see Indiana's growth. It's they're I think they're the youngest team in the league. To see them sort of, like I said earlier, build on last season, and then just see what Aaliyah Boston can do at the pro level when she's not being triple or quadruple teamed. It's just going to be fun to see their development. A big thing for me leading up to the start of the season is rosters and cuts. There's so many teams that have like way more players at training camp than they can carry for the season. And, like 17, 18 players when you got to get it down to 12, 11, and to see that play out. And then the level of competition, I think, as we mentioned, is going to be, I think, very good this year. It's always good, but I think it's, just going to be another level this season. And then to see, like we talked about again, what other teams step up, aside from, all the talk about New York and Las Vegas, to see what other teams sort of rise to the occasion.
Yeah, when it comes to, being like the level of competition, kind of the talent that's spread out, I do agree. And I think that this is another reason why we're ready for expansion, by the way. But I do think that even, as we continue to progress with the amount of talent that's coming out of the college game, there's obviously the same amount of spots. There's not any more spots than what there was. Even you could argue there's even less because a lot of teams carry 11 players instead of 12. But I mean, we're only going to get better top to bottom on rosters if we don't expand. And that's good. Obviously you're improving what's already here, but I do think that they need to expand to obviously spread out that, talent a little bit and provide more opportunities. That's a whole other conversation. But I do agree that, with top to bottom, I think that a lot of teams are better than what we've kind of seen in years past, which is great. And it's going to be exciting to watch. That's for sure.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it is a whole other conversation talking about expansion. And just a quick side note, but how weird is it that the information came out? I think Richard Deitch put something out about how, a conversation with Kathy Engelbert where she talked about, they had 100 teams or 100 cities, excuse me, targeted, and they're trying to get it down. I'm like, weren't they trying to get it down from 20 just last year, and saying they're going to pick a city by the end of the year? What happened? Like, where did that come from?
I feel like we're in an endless cycle when it comes to the WNBA. We're almost there, and then they're like, oh wait, we got to evaluate, we got to step back, we got to, I don't know. I don't get it.
It makes zero sense, even coming from the WNBA, to like put it out there so fervently that something was going to happen by the end of the year, and then all of a sudden, like, why even put that out there if you really don't have your ducks in a row with it? If you're really unsure, and you really aren't positive